the post-1990 era of that you could probably describe as predominantly an American unipolar period is over. And it really became over sometime during the course of the last 10 to 15 years. It has become more obvious now, but people who had been observing the changing economic patterns from over the last 20 odd years, whilst they might argue over a specific year or a specific date, generally have the view that things began to change qualitatively by the mid-2010s, and something resembling a multipolar world, even if that is continually evolving as far as what it looks like, has already come into existence.
On this episode of the What the Finance podcast, I have the pleasure of welcoming on Warwick Powell. Warwick is an adjunct professor at Queensland University of Technology, and he's working at the intersection of China, digital technology, supply chains, financial flows, and global political economy and governance. So, Warwick, thanks so much for coming on the podcast today.
A pleasure.
No problem. And was saying that it's difficult time frames to get in line, so it's a lot late my time, early your time. But I'm glad we could sort of put this together. But where I want to start, and I normally start, sort of looking at the economy and overall outlook. But I think it'd be quite interesting because saying there you're sort of an expert on China and I guess what's happening there. So I thought it'd be interesting to hear your opinion about the current sort of US-China relationship and maybe where it's come from and where it is currently.
Yeah, look, I think it's fair to say that the current relationship, certainly at what you'd call a diplomacy level, is at probably the lowest level for quite some time. I mean, in some respects, you could say that the style of interactions has stabilized a little bit. There are some formal mechanisms in place which both sides are engaging each other through, which from an international relationships point of view are important because at least they provide some frameworks and guardrails and institutions that are, if nothing else, predictable. The other thing I would say is that it is always better that parties are able to communicate with each other than not, even if they struggle for whatever reasons to find any serious common ground. There is no prospects of finding common ground if you can't talk with each other. So being able to keep those channels of communications open is important. The economic relationship, of course, captures the headlines these days, particularly as the United States has framed its relationships with China through the lens of great power rivalry and peer competition, so much so that, in fact, there are some within the political establishment in the United States that sees the relationship with China as an existential one. The economic dimensions manifest probably in two main ways. One is this question of technology leadership, which has seen the United States introduce and progressively intensify its efforts to curtail China's ability to access technologies and to develop technologies based on some core resources, whether they are in microprocessors or in the ability to manufacture microprocessors. The other dimension is in the trade aspects, where the United States has, since around 2018, embarked on a policy of tariff-based management, if you will, of the trading relationships with China. Now, that comes from a very particular set of ways in which the US political establishment has ultimately diagnosed its own problems. And I would suggest that, in fact, the diagnostic frame that points the finger at trade in many regards misses the point. And the reason why there are issues around trade imbalances has got a lot more the progressive hollowing out of American industry and the growing expansion of the financial sector as a part of the United States economic structure, that has over time reduced the extent to which the United States is able to meet its own requirements in terms of manufactured goods. As far as technology is concerned, it's quite clear that no matter how high the wall is and how big the yard is, that the policy so far is not really working. At best, it is causing China and Chinese firms to spend time, energy, and some resources developing their own capabilities that perhaps they might not have had to do otherwise. But by and large, it is the prohibitions and restrictions, I would suggest at best, is creating some delays. The flip side is that it has spurred on a level of research, development, and commercialization activity in China that probably would not have taken place, and that ultimately will create medium-term challenges for the United States as unintended consequences. So pretty challenging times at the moment, Anthony, both at a political level, but also at an economic level where the policy initiatives are largely impacting the United States in ways far more than it is impacting China.
Okay, thanks for laying that out. So, where do you see this starting? Because I know there's lots of talk about early 2010s, concerns about intellectual property, and maybe China not sort of you know following through with what the US and other Western countries are after in terms of that aspect. Is that sort of where it started, or what was happening there?
Look, in the mid 1990s, the United States began a new debate domestically about how it would relate to China and what it would do, so to speak, in relation to China. And at the time, the administration view, which was the Clinton administration, was that the United States interests would be best served by bringing China into the global economic fold, particularly through admitting China to the World Trade Organization. Now, even at the time, there were critics of that approach and of the framework that the Clinton administration brought to the table, which is that through trade liberalization and engagement with China and the entanglement of China within an American-dominated global economic setup, that China would change. And there were critics of that view at the time that believed that that was foolhardy and wrong-headed. In any event, come 2000, China was admitted to the World Trade Organization, and in many regards, as people would say, the rest is history. However, what's important to understand is that the hollowing out of American manufacturing began well before China's accession to the World Trade Organization. And if you go back to the 1970s, the latter half of the 1970s in particular, there were already growing concerns in the American political and research and academic environment about what was described as the hollowing out or the deindustrialization of the United States. And those concerns clearly were evident for reasons unrelated to China's ascension to the World Trade Organization. So the first thing is that China was engaged by the United States, and the United States approved and gave the green light to China's ascension to the World Trade Organization. 18 years later, the United States political establishment, I think, came to a view that engagement did not deliver what the United States anticipated it would or hoped that it would. And it's probably fair to say that the critics of the time, of the 1990s, would now say, I told you so. The hope that China would liberalize and change in the image of the West as a result of exposure to so-called Western economic models and processes and institutions simply didn't happen. And we saw by 2017, 2018, the consolidation of a sense of buyer's regret. The Foreign Affairs magazine ran a special issue in 2018 that explored this question of was engagement worthwhile or not. And the broad conclusion was that engagement really wasn't worthwhile. It didn't deliver the changes of China that the Americans had believed that they could engineer. And particularly from then on, a radical reframing of China began to take place, from a place in which the United States sought to change to a place that the United States would now seek to contain and hold back. The idea that the United States actively sought to change China is actually demonstrated by comments that Jake Sullivan made earlier this year, when he remarked at an event that the United States had, over a number of decades, not just recently, but over a number of decades, had sought to change and mold China, and that this had not succeeded. So we've got a context now of an attempt to shape and mold China, a recognition that those attempts did not deliver the hoped for or anticipated outcomes, which then set the stage for the turn to hostilities from the American political establishment in the face of an intensification of industrial hollowing out. So that's where we're at today.
Okay. And why, I guess, why hasn't China changed? Is it just due to, yeah, maybe I'll keep it there and you can take a review on.
Look, there are some who would say that China did change. And in many regards, of course, China today is a different country from what it was 25 years ago. There is no two ways about that, that in many respects, China has evolved and is not the same place as it was 25 years ago, let alone 45 years ago. But there are parts of a place like China which has deep historical roots and an extended and continuous civilization that aren't simply thrown out, despite the fact that a new set of engagements have been promoted and enacted. So, it was, in a sense, the height of hubris to think that a multi-millennia old civilization could somehow be shaped and molded into the image that someone else wanted. It was never going to happen, and the passage of time has shown that a place like China, which has significant historical, cultural, and, as time has gone on, economic heft, is going to be in a position to define its own pathways and define the ways in which it will reform itself and drive its own development. And I think that probably caught many in Washington off guard, because Washington, you've got to remember, had a view, particularly after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, that the Washington worldview and what America in that worldview represented, which was the pinnacle of human civilizational development, would naturally supersede, all those other civilizations that weren't at the pinnacle, and that hasn't happened. And China has demonstrated that you can't rip a place out of its own history.
Yeah, no, that's a really interesting thing. Thanks for explaining that. So how does China see itself? As you said, is it just looking to? I'm not sure if this is you who said this, or I was listening to somewhere and it said, it's had lots of, I guess, embarrassments, or it's been, over the past few hundred years. As you said, it's a very historic sort of country, or sort of people who are thousands of years old, but the past few hundred years haven't been very good. So is this bringing it back to that forefront of, um, respect? What is it after? I
Well,
guess
I
that's a
think the
big
first,
question for a billion people. Everyone wants
well, I
something
think,
else.
well, in a very broad sense, like most other nations, they want to improve the standard of living of the people that live there. So, and it is difficult to understand a place without understanding its own sense of its history. And clearly, the experiences of the 100 years between the 1840s and the 1940s has left a very, very deep scar in terms of China's own political culture and its ways of relating to the non-Chinese world. Now, China has, of course, during the various millennia, engaged in all sorts of interactions with people outside of the Chinese civilizational footprint, whether it was with the Mongols in the nearby steppe regions in the north and the northwest, right through, of course, to interactions with the civilizations of Persia, of West Asia, Central Asia, and of course the Indian and South Asia and Southeast Asian civilizations over this period of time. So China has, for most of its history, always had some dealings with the external world. Now, during that 100 years of what the Chinese would call 100 years of humiliation, it experienced a very, very bad relationship with the external world, which sought to conquer China and exploit China. And that sets the backdrop, if you will, for some of the national priorities that continue to shape the ways in which the Chinese political establishment frames their public policy um, approaches. So, creating a nation in which the people living there have a high standard of living is foundational to what a society seeks to do. It also wants to be able to mobilize that capability to ensure that that society is stable, safe, and secure. These aren't sort of rocket science insights. I think they are pretty fundamental to the ways in which most governments around the world seek to frame their priorities. And China, in that regard, isn't that different. It remains a country that is on a development pathway. Many people will have in their minds the images of high tech factories and amazing cityscapes, and more recently, of course, those images of the drone displays. 10,000 plus drones creating amazing visual effects in the night sky. So this sense of China being a high tech, uh, incredibly advanced place is, in many regards, the dominant imagery that people would have. But people in China and the government in China also knows that away from that is is a reality of many townships and villages and smaller cities that still require a considerable amount of economic and social development, whether it's through infrastructure, training, capacity building, and ultimately boosting the living standards of um, hundreds of millions of people. So China still has a lot of work ahead of it as far as achieving its own stated objectives, which is to be a moderately prosperous society by 2035.
Okay, yeah. Thanks for explaining that. So how does the recent economic, I guess, you know, I don't know if you'd say turmoil, maybe it's turmoil in some markets. How has that impacted that goal? Because if we look at, what everyone's been hearing, I guess maybe this is a Western skew, but there's been lots of issues with the real estate markets, maybe investments that was made in certain regions which didn't need to be made. Maybe not the best use of capital to deliver those goals. So how has that impacted that recent or their goals to achieve that?
I think again, you've just got to put some of this into a little bit of a historical context. And this is a context of the various phases of China's economic development over the course of the last 4 decades or so. From the early 1980s onwards, we saw in China a economic development model that emphasized rural revitalization and the revitalization of rural and township economies, far more so than an emphasis on the big cities and heavy industries. And that model, or that focus of economic development, was incredibly successful in generating and unleashing the capacity of sort of small and medium enterprises right across the Chinese landscape. Come the 1990s, the model shifted gear, and it shifted gear towards a commitment to urbanization. So having gotten the countryside back on its feet and stabilized and revitalized the food production systems, as well as begun to create the early pieces of distributed industrialization. You got to remember that a lot of the industry that happened in China, the emergence of manufacturing actually took place in a distributed environment with small scale industry taking place in rural and small town settings. But the transition then moved into a greater commitment to an urbanization drive. And that urbanization drive, coupled with the beginnings of investment in critical infrastructure, and particularly energy infrastructure, were principal features of the 1990s, laying the groundwork for what we then saw take place in the 2000s. So the 2 decades or so of the 2000s is what many people, of course, associate with China's economic development. But the work that was done in those previous 2 decades was actually quite fundamental to laying the groundwork. As we moved into the 2000s and urbanization kicked in, the program really revolved around progressive fixed capital accumulation, which was buildings, accommodation, factories, enabling people to migrate from the countryside to the cities to fill the work needs of the growing array of factories that were emerging, particularly in coastal China. But that program, if you will, was disrupted to some extent by the global financial crisis. So the global financial crisis of 2008 reverberated through China because it affected the demand for manufactured outputs that China had begun to develop and service the world with. And it also created liquidity issues in the global market that put a lot of pressure on the Chinese program of industrialization and urbanization. So come the early 2010s, the Chinese government then embarked on a very, very large scale stimulus in response to the shadow of the global financial crisis. Now, that stimulus was very heavily focused on urban infrastructure development and intra-urban infrastructure development. So what you would probably broadly call network infrastructure that facilitated mobility. So we're talking about transport infrastructure, electrification infrastructure, and telecommunications infrastructure, as well as water infrastructure. So all of these network infrastructure capabilities focused on what you could broadly call a mobility economy, to be able to move people, electricity, resources, energy, whatever, quicker and easier and less costly around the country. That program and that massive injection of liquidity and subsequent to that credit growth drove property development in ways that ultimately led by 2017, 2018 to very serious concerns amongst the monetary authorities that China was on the edge of what they called their own Minsky moment. So the Minsky moment is named after the economist Hyman Minsky, who developed the financial instability hypothesis, which spoke about how finance itself laid the seeds or sowed the seeds of its own destabilization, which would ultimately lead to financial crises. So there were concerns by 2017, 2018 that the credit overhang in the property sector was exposing the Chinese economic system to its own Minsky moment risks. Now, you've got to remember that by 2017, annual credit growth in the property sector had reached about 22%. And that came off the back, incidentally, of a boom from 2014 to say 2016, 2017 of a totally new credit sector, which was the peer-to-peer credit world, which created all sorts of problems in terms of projects going bad, people running off with other people's money, and those sorts of fraud and malfeasance issues. So there were concerns come 2017, 2018 that financial stability was at risk. And a big part of that was the leverage in the residential property sector. You'll recall that in 2018, the government made it clear that the government had a view that housing was for living in, not for speculating. And the message went out very, very clearly to the property sector that the days of excessive leverage and easy credit was over. Now, many property developers actually began to sell down their portfolios and bring and deleverage. And that happened quite extensively. And in fact, there are many Chinese property related companies that had grown their global portfolios that actually began to sell down their global positions. And we saw that even in Australia, where many projects that were owned by Chinese developers hit the market and were being sold before they were being developed. A small number of developers, in many regards, ignored the calls by government for voluntary deleveraging, and when they could not access credit through their traditional banking channels, proceeded to raise capital from global markets through the issuance of their own debt instruments. So the cases of Evergrande and others like that are the ones that, of course, will stick in people's minds. So the property sector really boomed, I guess, is the story. The issue with the booming property sector, Anthony, was that it also created its own imbalances. Not only was there concerns around excessive leverage in a financial risk point of view, but it also meant that the national resources being mobilized for other things was being held back. So what we have seen over the last few years is actually a very conscious attempt to do a few things. And I would paint this picture for you and your viewers, hoping that this will help you sort of see the multi-dimensional nature of the restructure that's taking place today. So I've set the backdrop of what's happened, and the restructure that's taking place today involves three intertwining threads, wrapped by an overarching story, if you will, of energy transition. So the three intertwining threads are a shift of the composition of social capital, where national resources are committed from the property sector to other areas, and those other areas predominantly are in high technology, manufacturing, robotics, digital economy, and clean energy. The second thread is that as part of this capital restructuring is a demographic restructuring of the distribution of wealth and income. And we see in that process a greater commitment to the incomes and the wealth of the lower three quintiles, so up to the lower 60% of household incomes across the country, have actually been where the emphasis has been put, and household incomes have been growing faster in rural areas, for example, than they have been in urban areas. And the third dimension is a spatial dimension. So there's a geographic dimension to this as well, which is to spread the economic growth of the country from a relatively small number of cities, key tier 1 and tier 2 cities, to a broader number of cities such as tier 3 and tier 4 cities. And all of that is being enabled by an energy transition towards cleaner, greener, renewable energy systems. So that's what's been going on. Now, as you embark on this significant restructuring and rotation, these series of rotations, they invariably don't happen necessarily smoothly. And the adjustments as one area of economic activity is constrained, namely property credit growth. So property credit growth dropped down to less than 3% per annum 2 or 3 years ago. As you contract that and boost other areas, the challenge in the restructuring is whether or not the boosting is happening at a fast enough pace to absorb the loss of employment of resources in these other areas. So that's what's been going on.
Okay, yeah, thanks for setting that out. It's a great explanation of the history of the economic model and how it's evolved. And I think it's sort of getting to the point now, if I'm not mistaken, the manufacturing focus has been sort of the past 3 years or so, especially when the real estate really started hitting the fan. And since then, there's been a massive increase in capacity. And I imagine the challenge with that is, can that continue? We're already seeing, you need demand to come from somewhere for these products. It's not coming from China.
Well, it is actually.
It is. Okay.
So this is the interesting thing, right? As property has been contracted through the constriction of credit into the property sector, the adjustments that have been made in the national economy, certainly at aggregate levels, seems to actually have been quite successful. And I say that with one key measure in mind, namely unemployment. So the unemployment rate has bubbled around the 5.2, 5.3% pretty much throughout this entire restructuring process. And what that tells you is that the unemployment that's caused through the contraction in the property sector is being redeployed and reemployed elsewhere. So at a macro level, the restructuring is actually working kind of okay. The question about the growth in manufacturing capacity is always an interesting one, because the argument that's been run is that somehow that creates this issue of, quote, overcapacity, unquote. The reality is that the vast majority of new output from manufacturing is absorbed domestically. And if you look at the exports to output ratio of Chinese manufacturers, you'll see that over the course of the last 30 years, we have witnessed, firstly, a growth in the export to output ratio between, say, 1995 to 2005, at which point the exports to output ratio for Chinese manufacturers reached its peak. There was a bit of a blip a couple of years ago with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which, as Russia lost its ability to trade with other countries, Chinese exports grew, right, to fill that market void. But generally speaking, Chinese exports to output ratio for manufacturers has been declining, settling in at about 15% now, which is pretty close to where things were at in 1995. Now, if you look at an area like EVs, which of course grabs all the headlines, EVs in China really hit the world stage around 2020. Now, that of course wasn't just a function of an overnight event, but it was a consequence of a good decade or so of investment in research and development in key supply chain capabilities. But when EVs began to get manufactured at scale, for the years 2020 through to 2023, so those 4 years, the output continued to grow, as we know, but the extent to which China's total output in EVs was absorbed domestically hovered between 75 and 85%. So some years, 25% of the output was exported, in other years about 15%. All at the same time, output was growing. This year, so far, over 90% of EV output is being absorbed in the domestic market. Now, how does that happen? Well, it happens because household incomes are growing. So household incomes have been growing consistently now since, well, for the past 10 years easily. And in fact, household incomes have grown sevenfold in the last 12, 13 years. So household incomes have been key to the other side of the coin. So investment leads to output growth, which has also driven household income growth off the back of productivity. Where does this income come from? Well, the income is earned by workers working in factories doing things, and those factories exist and are able to do the things that they do by virtue of investment. So household incomes is a function of investment, actually. And without the investment, you don't get household income. So the Chinese economic model, if you will, continues to see much of its output absorbed through domestic consumption. The output growth, of course, is tremendous because of scale and productivity that we've seen, and automation driving productivity. But the reality is that households continue to consume. The big question mark that people have is whether households, as their incomes have grown, will spend a little bit more of those increments of income growth going forward. So for every extra dollar of income growth that households receive, they clearly don't spend an extra dollar, right? They save some of that. And the desire, the public policy desire, is that they actually spend a little bit more of that income growth than they currently do.
Hey everyone, sorry for interrupting. I just wanted to extend a massive thank you to you for listening and tuning in, and for your support over these 3 years. So we've had, hundreds of guests that we've welcomed on the podcast. We've had millions of views with hundreds of thousands of different people listening in. So I just wanted to thank you. I started this as a student. I'm now currently working, and I've always done this on the side just because I have a passion for it and I've enjoyed it. And probably similar to yourself, you listen to all these, different YouTube channels and podcasts of people listening to different guests. That's how I started, and I just wanted to sort of take the plunge and be able to have the opportunity to speak to these people, and you've made that happen. So thank you very much. Just myself, don't make any money from this, and it's really a passion project. So thanks for supporting that passion of mine. If you wanted to support the channel, all I ask is if you could like, subscribe, or even comment, positive or negative feedback. I'm always willing to take constructive criticism. I'd really appreciate that. But otherwise, thanks so much. If you can believe it, only 14% of our listeners actually subscribe to the podcast. So if you can, great. If not, no problem at all. Thanks for listening, and let's get back to the show. Yeah, okay, that makes sense. So do you see what you're saying is that what the West is doing, and sort of by putting up the tariffs, do you think that's just very early precautions, or do you think that's just a concern about what could come, or what do you think that's sort of influenced by?
Look, it's a look. I mean, there's a range of arguments as to why tariffs have been the response. Some of those is around this idea of protecting existing industries, right? So this is an attempt to dampen the competitive threat from a pricing point of view of low-cost imports. Other arguments go to that they create the room for the development of domestic industries, and thereby help bring the jobs back, right? Quote unquote. The evidence so far would suggest that the tariffs have not brought the jobs back. They haven't worked in the intended economic sense. They have delivered a political dividend for initially Trump, and whether they deliver a political dividend to the Democrats coming into the election in a month's time or so, well, again, time will see, time will tell. But the evidence so far is that the tariffs that were introduced in 2018 simply did not bring the jobs back to the heartland at all. At best, the effects were relatively neutral economy-wide. At worst, the estimates are that it actually increased costs and hampered a lot of other businesses that depended upon low-cost inputs. So, you know, as I said earlier, I think that the response has largely been the result of a misdiagnosis. The problem isn't trade per se. Trade is a symptom of something else. So putting band-aids over trade doesn't necessarily help you address the fundamental issues around industrial ecosystems and the capacity to deliver globally cost competitive manufactured outputs in a way that also employs a lot of people. So you've got to remember that even though hollowing out of manufacturing has been a critical concern for close to 50 years, in dollar terms, the manufactured outputs, has actually continued to grow. It's just that manufacturing contributes, firstly, a smaller percentage of the total GDP. So it's less important in terms of the overall accounting value of the American national economy. And of course, it employs, as a sector, in absolute terms, a lot less people than it ever did. So output has continued to grow, but other sectors have grown a lot faster, and employment has, of course, been stripped out of this sector, going way back to the 1970s. So that is where I think the Western world is at in terms of tariffs. In some of the categories that they're looking to introduce tariffs into, even with the tariffs, the Chinese manufactured products continue to be highly price competitive anyway. So whether or not that will deter consumers, well, again, time will tell. One of the interesting things that I think is happening nonetheless is that there is a progressive spatial distribution of new productive and assembly capacity from Chinese manufacturers. So we are seeing a growing capacity of Chinese firms to establish manufacturing and assembly plants in other countries to service those markets directly, to be closer to the end markets, and arguably, in some circumstances, to also mitigate the impact of tariffs. Now, that's happening, for example, in the case of Hungary and the EU, where the establishment of EV manufacturing in Hungary puts the factory on the inside of any potential tariff regimes or any tariff regimes. Now, what's the consequence of that? Well, in one sense, it enables that particular factory and the outputs from that factory to to bypass or not be impacted by the import tariffs because they're not imports. But whether or not those factories will now pass on the full savings or actually price in the market, accounting for the fact that there are tariffs, well, again, I think time will tell, but it is quite reasonable to anticipate that those factories will price in the market at levels that have actually been determined by or impacted by the tariffs. So the price that consumers will pay will ultimately be a price that includes some, if not all, of the price increase that tariffs would drive, even if the products are being manufactured from inside the tariff wall as opposed to from outside the tariff wall. So I don't think that they're going to be that useful. The third feature in all of this, Anthony, ultimately is the fact that the rest of the world continues to grow, and they will be beneficiaries of both low-cost, high-quality products, as well as China's growing outbound investment. So the fact that Chinese firms are able to deliver globally competitive priced high-tech products means that increasingly the markets that had historically been priced out of these sorts of things are now being priced into these sorts of things.
Yeah, and if we couple that, growing friction in trade with geopolitical concerns, to do with Taiwan, which we haven't even mentioned yet, but I guess as well as China's, it's hard to tell if it's a ally or just a link to BRICS countries, Iran, Russia, Ukraine. It does seem like there's a move towards a multipolar sphere of influence where China, as you said, it might not be on purpose, it might be forced, but it is moving to this point where they are going to have a large sphere of influence.
Yeah, look, the post-1990 era of that you could probably describe as predominantly an American unipolar period is over. And it really became over sometime during the course of the last 10 to 15 years. It has become more obvious now, but people who had been observing the changing economic patterns from over the last 20 odd years, whilst they might argue over a specific year or a specific date, generally have the view that things began to change qualitatively by the mid-2010s, and something resembling a multipolar world, even if that is continually evolving as far as what it looks like, has already come into existence. American unipolarity, the ability of the collective West to impose its will on countries around the world, has clearly diminished. It's quite obvious in the area of the attempts by the United States and the collective West to impose sanctions regimes on others is becoming increasingly difficult to make stick, let alone have real impacts. The ability for countries to diversify their economic relationships away from these at-risk exposures to collective Western sanctions is real, and therefore countries and enterprises are doing that. The evolving payment systems also supports the de-risking of countries that seek to mitigate the extent to which their value transfer activities, trade, can be unceremoniously intercepted and stymied by third parties. So, an attempt to engage in economic transactions outside of a US dollar regime is growing, and we see that in obvious cases of Russian trade because it was forced to, But what that also tells you is that in an environment where countries must do something because they have little alternatives but to do something, it can now be done. No longer are countries pushed into a position where they essentially have no options but to, in a sense, capitulate and ask for forgiveness, so to speak, and be brought back into a particular economic fold. That's no longer viable. We see that in the ways in which the sanctions have failed, both in terms of the extent to which supposedly willing participants, such as European enterprises, are skirting sanctions by exporting to Russia through Central European transshipment markets, the extent to which European oil buyers are buying processed product from Indian refineries, when everyone knows, of course, that that the crude is Russian crude coming in at a very competitive pricing, being processed in India, and charging a premium to the Europeans. It is plain for everyone to see that the architecture of global transactions has changed to a point where the ability of a single power to censor other powers is dramatically diminished. The attempts to use global insurance to impose a price cap on Russian oil has failed. Alternative global insurance capabilities have emerged quickly to deliver the maritime commercial insurance that has been required to enable this trade to happen. The ability for alternative container fleets to operate outside of the surveillance reach of the collective West has also emerged very, very quickly. So the physical and technical and financial infrastructure that points to the decline and ultimately the disappearance of the unipolar moment are all in place today.
And you see that continuing until there are these two separate sort of systems in place?
Well, the extent to which there are two systems, I guess, will become clearer over the next 10 years. I think the interesting thing is not that there is likely to be, in some respects, two systems, but it's how parties can navigate the interoperability between these two systems and whether or not that's possible. And given the extent to which national economies are intertwined through particularly trade relationships, but also the movement of capital and investment relationships, there is a distinct possibility that countries that you would today think would lean towards holding onto and continuing to seek to uphold the dominance of the US dollar set of institutions will ultimately be compelled to be able to, at a minimum, operate in all environments. Take Australia as a classic case in point. Australia's trading relationships are predominantly with China and with Asia, actually. And as China and Asian nations continue to deepen their economic integrations at a trade and at an institutional level, and potentially also at a non-US dollar payments systems level, then a place like Australia will need to ultimately be able to also operate in that environment. And it will be hard to see how a country like Australia would cut off its nose to spite its face by denying itself the economic benefits of trading with those outside of the USD dominated systems, simply to preserve the US dollar, system. So whether or not there are two systems evolving, well, the extent to which there are distinct systems, time will tell. But I suspect there are going to be plenty of countries that will actually need to work across this entire fabric anyway.
Yeah, they're probably the ones that are going to get the most advantage, like India and Indonesia and other sort of growth countries that seem to be playing both sides.
Well, I think this issue of sides is an interesting one, right? Because there are some who want to paint this as a question of two systems with two poles, whereas I think that what we're starting to see is actually two systems without a doubt, but it's actually an evolution from a system that has been dominated by a single pole to a system in which no single pole can actually dominate and censor others. Now, that's going to be, the real test. So it's a qualitative transformation in the system as opposed to simply changing or passing on of the baton. So the global economic setup is evolving in a far more multinodal way, where nations are driving more sophisticated and multi-dimensional relationships with others as a means of increasing their own diversification of their economic relationships. And through this process of increased diversification of their economic relationships, they aim to firstly protect themselves from the effects of somebody dominating you because they've got an asymmetric relationship with you. But importantly, from a systemic point of view, it creates a web of interwoven interests in the stability of the system itself. And what that lends itself towards is the creation of a mindset and an approach to international relationships that sees prosperity and peace as symbiotic objectives and which sees them as two sides of the same coin. So you aren't making an either or choice between prosperity or security and peace, but in fact, you see security, prosperity, and peace as part and parcel of a singular collective effort.
Yeah, and I think that's something that we might need another hour to discuss about to unpack. I would be amiss not to ask about. I think that a lot of the big news over the past few weeks has been the sort of the China fiscal support that they've sort of just recently put in, and I probably should have asked that earlier. But I'm interested to hear your opinion on that and sort of what impact do you see this having? It seems like there's sort of more of a push away, as you said, real estate's gone away for a while, but more of a push for Chinese to invest in their stock markets. Is that what we're saying? What else does it show?
Well, look, I think the first thing to say is that the overriding objective is to achieve somewhere around 5% GDP growth, and that overriding objective, when you extrapolate that out to 2035, enables China to meet its own specified objectives of being a moderately prosperous society by that time. So somewhere around the 5% is what they're after. The measures announced last week were actually pretty modest in the scheme of things. They were certainly weren't the bazooka that some people talk about. If you want to talk bazookas, you talk about the stimulus that was injected into the system in 2011. The measures that have been announced to date are quite measured. They focused, I think, around a number of key areas as part of a continual, adjustment process in macroeconomic settings. And what we see, and if you think back to my earlier remarks about those three intertwining threads of the restructure or those three great rotations that are taking place, is that the reduction in interest rates clearly aims to reduce borrowing costs, and those borrowing costs will principally affect the real disposable incomes of higher income households. So the aim there is to get those higher income households to spend a little bit more. And bearing in mind that higher income households make up a lion's share or a disproportionate share in any sense of national household incomes, then that will have a fairly substantial flow-on effect in terms of aggregate consumption growth anyway. So a relatively modest change in the cost of borrowings aims to free up or to create real income growth amongst higher income households, particularly. The second thing it's done, we've seen some effects of this already, is that it will catalyze, particularly through some exuberance, higher income households to dive back into the property market. And we've seen that in Shanghai already. That's not really, I think, the real intent of the policy, but it's a livable or it's a side effect that policymakers can live with, because it's actually a pretty modest impact at the high end of the property market. The overarching aim remains, nonetheless, to stabilise the property sector. And what we've seen, as I described earlier, was obviously massive credit growth leading into 2018, which unsurprisingly also accompanied massive price growth. So credit growth drove price growth. The growth in prices in property did a few things. One, it obviously led to increased speculation, which created inflationary drivers within the property market anyway, so it fed on itself. But secondly, in terms of its social impact, it led to a blowout in the price to income ratios. Now, China's already an expensive place from a price to incomes ratio for housing compared to many other countries around the world. And in some cities like Shanghai and Beijing, the price to income ratio of, speaking of averages, is in the order of 30%. So, it's 30 years of income is the average price. 30 years of average income is the average price of a dwelling in Beijing, Shanghai, which is 10 times more than many comparable cities. So it became very, very expensive. Now, when you look at the price curves, and if you index that price curve for Chinese property, both in the first tier markets and in the other markets, you see the price index today, 2024, reach the levels that were around 2015. So literally the price growth that took place between 2015 and 2018, 2019, 2020 has all been pulled back. It's been pulled back to 2015 levels. And unsurprisingly, the regulators intervene at that level, because when you recontextualize it back to those discussions around financial risks, I think it's quite clear that there is a level of policy comfort with property price to household income ratios roughly around the levels that was the case around 2014, 2015. So the financial measures, interest rate measures, really go towards all of this stuff. The bonds issues are also relatively modest. They will enable, in the first instance, the release of some additional money into the economy generally. How that translates through the various mechanisms of expenditure, time will see in terms of the impact that they have. But the aim really was to make sure that, or to begin to nudge the economy, if you will, in a direction that gave policymakers comfort that that target of somewhere around that 5% mark would be achieved. Now, if there are concerns around the take-up or the feed-through impacts of these measures, if there are concerns that it's inadequate, then I think we could see a little bit more effort around things like, direct fiscal investments in infrastructure, in affordable housing, moving along a little bit quicker in finishing property products to get them into the market as affordable housing. Funds have been made available for local governments to acquire unfinished developments and complete them so that they become part of the social housing stock in a model very similar to what happens in Singapore, by the way. Now, that funding capacity has not really been mobilised to any great extent yet. So, I think that there's still a fair bit of potential liquidity sitting there in the system already that could readily find its way into the economic system as a whole. The last thing that I'll just mention briefly is as part of this transitional process, one of the interesting things about what China has done over many, many years is committed significant investments to education. And its investments in education has created a cohort in the population that is incredibly well educated, incredibly well skilled across many, many areas, including all of your core science and technology areas and mathematics that are absolutely foundational to the kinds of restructurings that we're talking about. So as far as there being sufficient workers with the right knowledges and skills, China's laid the groundwork to achieve that. So in summary, my sense of the measures announced a week or so ago at the end of September is that they are relatively modest, they're quite measured, and that they are really a little bit of a little bit more than a nudge, but probably a nudge by leaning the shoulder in a little bit to just give some parts of the economy a little bit of a kick along. But I certainly wouldn't describe it as some kind of a bazooka, as some mainstream commentators have.
Okay, and you see their sort of fiscal support being more, sounds like more iterative, if there were to be any future need, rather than big bazookas.
Yeah, because you've got to understand that household incomes have been rising. Unemployment has remained relatively steady, right? So the question you ask is, well, to what extent are there major issues? Well, if it is accepted that the slowdown in property, which has been engineered very deliberately, right, as we've described, has been insufficiently and without sufficient speed being compensated for by the growth in aggregate demand caused by the expansion in other areas, then this set of initiatives aims to just give that a little bit of a kick along, or at least to place a floor now in the deflation that has been engineered over the past 5 years in the property space. In some ways, it's a signal to the market that says enough's enough. Right? We deliberately deflated the market. We said we would deflate it from 2017, 2018 onwards in response to rising concerns about leverage and credit risk. We actively took measures in 2020 to bring credit growth in the property sector that was excessively leveraged to heal. We have driven growth in capital allocations and credit growth to other areas, taking advantage of the R&D and developments that have taken place in the last 10 years in core green technologies, energy-saving technologies, robotics, etc. And with those things taking place, the concern seems to be to put a floor under the deflation and try to activate the top quintile of households, because they're the ones who've experienced, by the way, the negative wealth effect the most. So the deflation that's happened in property values has, without a doubt, affected not even just the top quintile, the top 20%. It's actually affected the top 10% the most. Right? So this really is a very targeted measure, and it's because household incomes have actually been growing across the economy. Aggregate demand has actually been growing across the economy, but aggregate demand growth arguably is slightly insufficient in the eyes of the policymakers to give them that sense of confidence that that target of roughly 5% is definitely going to be hit. So that's what I think this is all about.
Okay, great. Thanks for explaining that. So, Warwick, thanks so much for your time today. Really appreciate it. My last question is, what is one message you'd like people to take away from our conversation?
Look, the world is going through significant change at the moment. There is no two ways about that. Sometimes it's turbulent, and at other times it appears very chaotic. The message I hope that people take away is that these transitions are being driven by very powerful economic forces that have the potential to deliver to the world a new plateau of economic development and prosperity based on a fairer and more even distribution of economic development opportunity. That's something that we should embrace. The hostile reactions and the violence that we've seen across the world as part of this process of turbulence and at times chaos is something that we should be, I guess, speaking up against. We don't actually need to have this kind of violence. Uh, this kind of violence obviously is tragic in terms of the human lives that are being lost, and at the same time, it uh, it doesn't help the ability of humanity generally to raise humanity's living standards, particularly in places that have historically been denied, and at the same time do it in a way that delivers the right kind of care that we want to the planet that we all share. So my message is, you know, see this as an opportunity where we can contribute to voices that promote people to think about how we achieve, I guess, what I've called a multipolar peace. The world is going to be different. It can be a better world, and we certainly doesn't need to be as violent a world as we currently have today.
Yeah, it's a great message. So, yeah, Warwick, thanks again. If anyone wanted to find out more about your work and what you do, where would the best places for that be?
Just look for me on Substack's probably the easiest at this stage. I publish pretty regularly there, both in terms of little daily notes and longer essays, and also from there, I periodically let people know what some of the links are to other places. That's probably the best starting point. Otherwise, the rest of the stuff is a little bit too academic, and I'm afraid it would bore people senseless.
You underestimate our listeners. Some of them love that, love that sort of thing. But no, I'll put Substack, and I'm sure they'll be able to find the rest of it. But thanks
That'd be
again for your
great.
time.
Absolute pleasure, Anthony.
Hey everyone, thank you for listening. I really appreciate the support. If you've got value out of this, I'd really appreciate it if you could like, subscribe, or comment. Good or bad feedback. I'm always open to that. But it really helps with the channel. As I said before, only about 14% of people actually subscribe to this channel. So if you were to that, it would really help. It could mean we could continue to grow. If not, thanks for watching, and see you on the next show. And you also might like this video right here. All right, thanks again.